David Haskell Hackworth entered this turbulent world on the 11th of November 1930 in Los Angeles, California, a date that seemed entirely prophetic. Born on Armistice Day, the sacred anniversary marking the end of the First World War, it was as if fate had explicitly marked this child for a lifelong military destiny. His early childhood was anything but privileged or comfortable, heavily defined by the crushing poverty of Depression-era America. His father vanished entirely while he was still young, leaving his struggling mother to provide for the family and forcing the boy to quickly learn harsh realities. Young David learned rapidly that everyday survival required immense toughness, absolute adaptability, and a stubborn refusal to ever quit. At merely 15 years old, an age considered a child by any reasonable standard, Hackworth did something that would be utterly impossible in today's strictly regulated society. He boldly lied about his age to military recruiters and formally enlisted in the United States Army. This was the dramatic final year of the Second World War in 1945, and desperate recruiters were simply not asking too many difficult questions about the eager boys standing before them. The determined teenager from Los Angeles officially became a sworn soldier long before he was legally old enough to drive a civilian car. Although he narrowly missed experiencing actual combat during the closing days of that global conflict, the impending war in Korea would soon give him everything he sought. When North Korean communist forces violently poured across the 38th parallel in the bloody June of 1950, David Hackworth was a highly aggressive 20-year-old sergeant, fiercely hungry for frontline action. He would quickly get it in massive quantities that would have instantly broken most ordinary men. The freezing mountains and historically bloody valleys of the Korean peninsula rapidly became his ultimate crucible, transforming the young, non-commissioned officer into something approaching an absolute legend. The staggering statistics from his Korean service alone would have permanently secured Hackworth's respected place in American military history. Through sheer combat excellence and unmatched bravery, he received a rare battlefield commission, rising directly from an enlisted man to an authoritative officer. He earned his first prestigious Silver Star, quickly followed by his second, and then incredibly his third, accumulating decorations like falling snowflakes in a massive winter blizzard. Each shiny medal represented a horrifying moment when David Hackworth had done something extraordinarily brave under intense enemy fire, yet Korea was merely the bloody appetizer. By the time the United States foolishly committed massive ground forces to South Vietnam in 1965, Hackworth had already served multiple grueling tours as a special military advisor. He understood the complex country, he thoroughly knew the invisible enemy, and he recognized the impending disaster. He saw with a dark certainty that dangerously bordered on prophetic vision that America was actively making catastrophic tactical mistakes from the very beginning. The systemic problems tragically began at the very top of the command chain and quickly infected absolutely everything operating below. Blind Washington politicians aggressively demanded high body counts, while ignorant Pentagon planners constantly praised overwhelming conventional firepower above all else. Arrogant generals stupidly measured tactical success by the sheer number of heavy artillery rounds endlessly expended, and the massive tonnage of explosive bombs dropped on empty jungles. The entire American war machine operated daily on a stubborn principle that Hackworth immediately recognized as fundamentally flawed and deeply disastrous for every soldier involved in the terrible fight. The misguided American leadership was desperately trying to win a complex guerrilla war using rigid, conventional tactics that were doomed to fail spectacularly. They were foolishly trying to defeat a phantom enemy who moved fluidly like water by pointlessly building massive dams of heavy steel and high explosives. And because of this profound strategic blindness, the dead bodies tragically kept piling up in horrifying numbers every single day. American bodies, Vietnamese bodies, the broken bodies of incredibly brave young men who desperately deserved much better military leadership than they ultimately received from their insulated superiors. This dark reality violently haunted Hackworth throughout his entire Vietnam service, pushing him to seek absolute combat perfection in a totally broken system. In 1966, he proudly took command of a specialized unit that would soon become completely legendary for all the wrong historical reasons, known as Tiger Force. The terrifying name alone instantly sent cold shivers through enemy ranks across the sweltering jungle environment. This was supposed to be a highly elite long-range reconnaissance patrol unit, incredibly aggressive and deeply lethal. purposefully designed to take the brutal fight directly to the hidden Viet Cong. Operating deeply within enemy territory, they were tasked with fighting the elusive guerrillas directly on their own unforgiving native ground. Under Hackworth's strict and brilliant command, Tiger Force initially achieved truly remarkable tactical successes that astonished top brass. They successfully penetrated heavily fortified areas that regular conventional infantry units simply could not ever hope to reach safely. They expertly gathered vital battlefield intelligence that directly saved countless American lives and killed enemy combatants with a terrifying efficiency that deeply impressed even the most critical and demanding military observers stationed in the dangerous region. But despite these undeniable tactical victories, Tiger Force tragically embodied absolutely everything that was fundamentally wrong with the aggressive American approach to Vietnam. The renowned unit gradually became globally infamous for horrific alleged war crimes and for displaying a shocking brutality that violently crossed moral lines no professional soldier should ever cross. Hackworth himself was never personally implicated in these documented atrocities, but he clearly witnessed the dark corruption that the endless war inflicted on otherwise decent men. He painfully observed the complete loss of humanity taking over the weary troops. He watched helplessly as the relentless administrative pressure for higher enemy body counts completely eroded the basic moral foundations of the troops. The purposeful dehumanization of the local enemy and the actively rotting military leadership from above perfectly combined to produce unspeakable historical horrors. These terrible actions permanently stained the proud reputation of the American military for many generations to come. The pointless war was systematically destroying his beloved army entirely from the inside out, turning good boys into monsters, and a deeply disgusted Hackworth simply could not look away from the unfolding tragedy. How could a brilliant military genius possibly win when his own beloved system was actively rotting from the inside out? The stubborn American military was blindly throwing the lives of young men straight into a brutal meat grinder, and Hackworth knew this massive machine could never be saved using outdated traditional methods. He desperately needed a radical tactical awakening to save his bleeding soldiers. But the shining light of ultimate combat truth was not found in Washington or West Point. It was quietly hiding at a remote, dusty base called Nui Dat. By the incredibly bloody year of 1969, Colonel David Hackworth took official command of the struggling 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment. This particular American unit possessed a miserable reputation for widespread tactical mediocrity, unnecessarily high combat casualties, and dangerously low troop morale. They vividly represented absolutely all the systematic problems that deeply plagued American conventional forces throughout the entire Vietnam War. They were excessively loud, extremely clumsy, and fundamentally unprepared for the brutal realities of the dense jungle environment. Hackworth immediately intended to ruthlessly change absolutely everything about how these broken men operated. He aggressively renamed this battered unit the Hardcore Battalion, an aspirational title meant to inspire raw, aggressive pride. He immediately imposed a level of strict military discipline that bordered on completely savage, terrifying his own subordinate officers. He ruthlessly drove out any weak commanders who simply could not meet his incredibly high combat standards. He quickly promoted those rare, aggressive individuals who clearly demonstrated genuine survival instincts and raw tactical brilliance under intense enemy fire. Within mere months, this previously broken formation dramatically transformed into a highly lethal fighting machine under his strict command. The revitalized Hardcore Battalion quickly became one of the most operationally effective American conventional units deployed in the entire Vietnam conflict. But even as he successfully transformed his own personal command, a deeply observant Hackworth recognized a profoundly disturbing strategic truth. His proud battalion, despite all his extreme disciplinary efforts and tactical adjustments, still fundamentally could not match pure combat perfection. He painfully realized this striking disparity only when he visited the remote Australian base located at Nui Dat. This specific fateful visit would permanently shatter his American military pride forever. The isolated Nui Dat military base sat deeply entrenched within Phuoc Thu province, serving as the designated Australian area of combat operations. The highly disciplined 1st Australian Task Force had firmly established this heavily fortified jungle encampment back in 1966. From this quiet, strategic location, they continuously conducted highly specialized covert operations that consistently produced unbelievable combat results. Frustrated American commanding generals sitting in Saigon could only desperately dream of ever achieving such incredibly high enemy kill ratios. Hackworth arrived expecting to see standard Allied operations, but instead witnessed absolute tactical perfection. The very first time Hackworth deeply observed these Australian combat methods, he experienced something remarkably close to profound professional shock. These exceptionally calm foreign soldiers operated in quiet ways that seemed almost wonderfully primitive compared to the standard loud American approach. There were absolutely no massive, deafening helicopter air assaults to loudly announce their arrival to the hidden enemy. He saw no massive defensive walls of protective artillery fire, nor any overwhelming application of heavy aerial bombardment designed to foolishly compensate for fundamental tactical deficiency on the actual muddy ground. Instead of relying on deafening explosions, an utterly mesmerized Hackworth carefully watched tiny five-man combat patrols simply slip into the dense green jungle. They moved with such incredible grace that they seemed to instantly vanish completely into the thick surrounding vegetation. These hardened men carried remarkably minimal combat equipment, ensuring they were incredibly light and highly lethal. Most astonishingly, they moved through the tangled underbrush without making a single audible sound. They were terrifying phantom warriors, completely rejecting the standard heavy American doctrine that violently demanded destroying the jungle with massive firepower. These elite Australian operators could effortlessly remain completely motionless for countless grueling hours in the sweltering heat. They patiently ignored biting insects, suffocating humidity, and extreme physical discomfort, while quietly waiting for the absolute perfect tactical moment to strike. And when they finally initiated their deadly ambushes, the violent results were absolutely devastating to the terrified Viet Cong. The highly skilled Australians had originally learned their specialized jungle craft during the brutal Malayan emergency, heavily refining these unique survival skills during subsequent dangerous combat operations in the deep jungles of Borneo. They had expertly brought this massive accumulation of specialized institutional wisdom directly to the incredibly hostile environment of South Vietnam. In this deeply unforgiving theater, their silent methods proved spectacularly effective against a highly elusive enemy that consistently outmaneuvered massive American conventional forces. But the deeply profound methods that impressed a seasoned veteran like Hackworth the most went far beyond simple infantry patrol techniques. The quiet Australians fundamentally understood something vital that arrogant American military planners stubbornly and proudly refused to ever truly accept about the actual nature of this terrible war. They deeply understood that actual jungle warfare fundamentally required extreme tactical patience rather than the loud application of massive blind firepower. They fully comprehended that successfully killing the elusive enemy meant actually finding the hidden enemy first without being prematurely detected. Most importantly, finding that invisible enemy required physically becoming an organic part of the breathing jungle itself, rather than trying to violently destroy it with endless explosives. These brilliant Australian tactical trackers could easily follow a tiny hidden trail that heavily armed American foot soldiers would blindly walk past and never notice. These exceptional trackers could flawlessly read deeply broken twigs, slightly compressed mud, and subtly disturbed green leaves exactly like reading clear printed pages in a detailed book. Many of these extraordinary men had actually learned these ancient survival skills directly from indigenous Aboriginal instructors back home. They were proudly inheriting ancient tracking skills meticulously developed over 40,000 long years of harsh Australian history. They expertly hunted dangerous human beings with the exact same patient, silent precision that their ancient ancestors had flawlessly applied to hunting fast kangaroos and wild emus. Because of these supernatural hunting abilities, the hardened Viet Cong fighters absolutely feared these quiet foreign operators deeply. The terrified local Vietnamese villagers simply called these invisible men dangerous ghosts who could silently strike without any warning. Meanwhile, incredibly frustrated American military officers enviously watched in something closely approaching absolute professional disbelief. They saw these tiny Australian combat patrols easily accomplish seemingly impossible tactical objectives that entire heavily armed American infantry battalions could simply never achieve. The glaring contrast in operational combat effectiveness was completely undeniable to any truly honest observer. Colonel Hackworth was simply too incredibly honest and fundamentally dedicated to ultimate combat truth to ignore what he clearly witnessed. He was far too deeply professional to ever let blind institutional pride foolishly blind him to the glaring tactical reality standing right before him. In his highly controversial memoir, About Face, Hackworth boldly wrote powerful words that still loudly echo through modern military history. He openly declared that the deeply professional Australians decisively taught the struggling American military a thing or two about conducting proper counterinsurgency in a highly hostile jungle. He stated extremely flatly, without any hesitation, that you will simply never find a better, more capable soldier in the dense jungle than a well-trained Australian soldier. He bravely went even further with his explosive professional praise, controversially claiming they were the absolute best combat operators in the entire theater. These were certainly not just casual, polite compliments coming from some ignorant armchair general or inexperienced civilian observer. These were incredibly serious professional combat assessments coming directly from the absolute most decorated infantry officer currently serving in the United States military. Hackworth was a legendary man who had personally seen considerably more frontline combat than almost any living American military officer. He was an incredibly harsh commander whose absolute standards for battlefield performance were universally legendary for their brutal severity. So, when David Hackworth publicly said the Australians were the absolute best, he meant it with deadly absolute certainty. Therefore, he quickly decided to do something utterly unprecedented about it, to aggressively save the precious lives of his own vulnerable soldiers, currently fighting and dying under his direct tactical military command. He recognized that merely acknowledging their undeniable superiority was simply not enough to change the bloody operational reality on the ground. He urgently needed to forcefully transplant this incredibly valuable institutional knowledge directly into the structural heart of his own struggling infantry battalion. He knew exactly what this drastic action would potentially cost him politically within the highly arrogant American command structure. But Hackworth consistently prioritized the sacred lives of his frontline troops far above any political considerations or the fragile, massive egos of his commanding generals sitting safely in Washington. To achieve this massive tactical transformation, Hackworth quietly orchestrated a deeply unprecedented joint training agreement with the Australian Operational Command. This incredibly bold strategic move was strictly designed to completely break the dangerous, ingrained habits of his conventionally trained junior officers. He wanted to violently strip away their foolish, unfounded American arrogance and forcefully replace it with the cold, silent, hyper-lethal patience he had clearly witnessed among the SAS operators. He was preparing to fundamentally rewrite the entire basic rulebook of American infantry engagement right in the deadly middle of a losing war. The greatest American soldier deeply recognized a vital combat truth that the blind Pentagon arrogantly ignored. But to actively save the lives of his bleeding infantrymen, the brilliant colonel prepared to make a deeply shocking command decision. This unprecedented move would be a massive, humiliating slap directly against the enormous pride of the entire United States military establishment. He was about to forcefully order the proud, highly educated officers of West Point to completely abandon their expensive academic textbooks and painfully bow their heads as humble students to a small foreign military force. A massive, fiery clash between the enormous, fragile ego of the American superpower and the desperate, bloody reality of frontline survival was about to violently explode. Would these highly arrogant young American lieutenants willingly swallow their massive pride to learn how to truly become silent ghosts in the deadly jungle? Or would the deeply entrenched, rotten military system violently crush Hackworth's desperate, brilliant attempt at saving lives? The unprecedented training experiment at Nui Dat was about to permanently alter the destiny of the famous hardcore battalion and seal Hackworth's tragic fate forever. This extremely controversial decision would undeniably send massive shockwaves directly up the rigid chain of military command all the way to Saigon. Arrogant American generals simply could not fathom why their most highly decorated combat commander was actively subverting standard operational doctrine. But Hackworth possessed a brilliant tactical mind that clearly saw far beyond the suffocating bureaucratic red tape destroying his beloved military. He clearly saw that true combat survival strictly required ultimate tactical flexibility, even if it meant openly acknowledging that the mighty American empire was fundamentally wrong about jungle warfare. He boldly stood entirely alone against an incredibly massive, deeply flawed military machine that foolishly valued political appearance far over actual combat effectiveness. The incredibly dangerous stage was finally set for an unprecedented internal rebellion that would eventually cost the legendary colonel absolutely everything he held dear. He was purposefully lighting a massive historical fuse that would completely destroy his own stellar military career in the ultimate pursuit of tactical truth. The stunning, silent lessons painfully learned alongside the invisible Australian ghosts were about to violently trigger an unstoppable, disastrous chain reaction. The fresh young lieutenants eagerly arriving at the newly named Hardcore Battalion received an incredibly unusual and shocking welcome from their terrifying new commander. Before these highly confident junior officers could ever take official command of any American infantry platoon, they faced a bizarre mandate. Before they could proudly lead young American soldiers into actual combat, they absolutely had to complete a strict requirement that existed nowhere else in the entire military. They had to temporarily abandon their American units and train directly under the Australian forces. Colonel Hackworth had personally negotiated this highly unorthodox training arrangement directly with the Australian Operational Command stationed at the remote Nui Dat base. His freshly minted American officers would be forcefully embedded with hardened Australian rifle companies for several grueling weeks. They would actively participate in actual deadly combat patrols deep within the hostile jungle. They were ordered to humbly learn specialized survival skills that absolutely no expensive American training program or military academy had ever provided them. It was a massive shock to their system. These incredibly proud young Americans initially arrived at the Australian camp feeling supremely confident in their expensive elite military education. They had successfully graduated from the prestigious Officer Candidate School or the legendary West Point Military Academy. They had successfully completed the demanding infantry officer basic course and proudly wore their shiny gold bars. They sincerely believed they fully understood the complex dynamics of jungle warfare because their arrogant American instructors had told them they were the absolute best in the entire world. The quiet, rugged Australians rapidly and ruthlessly educated these arrogant American lieutenants otherwise. For several agonizing weeks, the humiliated American officers painstakingly learned how to physically move through dense vegetation without making a single audible sound. They slowly learned to carefully read the muddy jungle floor for the microscopic signs of recent enemy passage. They painfully learned the superhuman patience strictly required for silent ambush operations that might last for several miserable days without making any actual enemy contact whatsoever in the freezing rain. These humbled officers quickly learned a painful tactical reality that completely shattered their previous academic training. They learned that calling in massive artillery firepower was strictly a desperate last resort, absolutely never a first response to a fleeting enemy contact. The Australians taught them that shooting blindly into the thick green vegetation only revealed their hidden positions to a highly adaptive enemy. Most importantly, these previously arrogant young men deeply learned the profound professional value of absolute humility in the face of nature. They painfully learned that the mighty and wealthy United States Army, possessing absolutely all its massive financial resources and advanced technological superiority, had incredibly much to learn. They realized they were fundamentally inferior in this specific environment to foreign soldiers who arrived in Vietnam carrying combat equipment that looked almost primitive by modern American standards. Stripped of their protective helicopters and endless artillery support, the Americans finally understood what pure, unadulterated infantry fieldcraft truly looked like in the hands of absolute masters. These completely transformed junior officers eventually returned to the American Hardcore Battalion and immediately applied their vital new tactical knowledge. They aggressively retrained their own confused American infantrymen, ruthlessly stripping away heavy gear and enforcing strict noise discipline on every single jungle patrol. The shocking operational results quickly spoke for themselves across the entire blood-soaked theater. Hackworth's heavily modified unit rapidly achieved astonishing enemy kill ratios that consistently matched or wildly exceeded absolutely any other American conventional formation currently operating in South Vietnam. The undeniable tactical improvements were absolutely miraculous for the young American soldiers fighting on the ground. The Hardcore Battalion's previously catastrophic combat casualties suddenly dropped to incredibly low levels. Their battlefield intelligence gathering dramatically improved because they were finally surprising the elusive enemy instead of constantly being ambushed themselves. His brave soldiers actually survived their terrifying combat tours and safely returned home to their waiting families. Hackworth had successfully proven that the brilliant Australian tactical methodology could indeed save countless American lives. The concrete mathematical proof was completely undeniable, written clearly in official after-action reports and massive reductions in friendly body bags. But the rigid American military establishment absolutely did not want to hear this desperately important life-saving message. The highly arrogant commanding generals comfortably sitting in Saigon and Washington had already deeply invested their entire professional careers in the flawed strategy of overwhelming conventional firepower. They had proudly built their shiny stars and formidable reputations strictly on inflated body counts and massive bombing tonnage. These stubborn senior leaders simply could not ever publicly accept that a relatively small allied Australian military force had developed vastly superior combat methods. They operated with merely a tiny fraction of massive American resources, yet they were undeniably winning their local sector of the grinding war. To openly admit this glaring truth would mean officially acknowledging that the massive American military machine was fundamentally wrong. It would mean confessing that highly educated American generals were completely incompetent regarding actual jungle warfare. The institutional pride of the enormous United States military fiercely demanded that American tactical solutions rigidly remain officially supreme, even when mountains of bloody evidence strongly suggested otherwise. Consequently, the incredibly defensive Pentagon deliberately chose to actively suppress the truth. They aggressively classified highly detailed operational reports that honestly compared American and Australian combat effectiveness in the jungle environment. They purposefully locked these vital, life-saving documents deep inside secure bureaucratic vaults where no inquisitive journalist or junior officer could ever easily find them. This deliberate cover-up extended deeply into the professional evaluation system of the military itself. Honest combat officers who openly praised the highly effective Australian methods entirely too loudly quickly found their promising military careers abruptly stalling without explanation. The rigid system aggressively punished those rare individuals who prioritized actual combat survival over blind adherence to flawed institutional doctrine. The United States Army essentially demanded absolute intellectual conformity, heavily penalizing any brilliant tactical innovation that made the top generals look foolish or incompetent. Colonel David Hackworth watched this willful, murderous institutional blindness with a constantly growing, uncontrollable professional fury. He had bravely handed the American military establishment the exact tactical blueprint needed to win battles and simultaneously save thousands of young American lives. Instead of gratefully adopting these proven methods, the arrogant generals chose to bury the evidence simply to protect their own fragile egos. Hackworth realized with sickening clarity that the military he truly loved cared far more about its political image than its bleeding soldiers. By the disastrous year of 1971, David Hackworth had finally reached his absolute psychological and professional breaking point. The endless, grinding war had already pointlessly consumed hundreds of thousands of precious American and Vietnamese lives with absolutely no end in sight. The fundamentally flawed military strategies he had loudly criticized for many frustrating years continued completely unchanged by the stubborn high command. The disastrous, incompetent senior leadership he had consistently condemned remained firmly entrenched in their comfortable, air-conditioned headquarters far from the mud. The horrifying consequence of this arrogant leadership was that the dead bodies tragically kept coming home to shattered families in cold aluminum boxes. Every single unnecessary death deeply carved another agonizing scar directly into Hackworth's heavily burdened conscience. He felt completely suffocated by the endless, sickening lies constantly peddled by optimistic politicians and dishonest military spokesmen during their daily press briefings. He intimately knew the absolute terrifying truth of the miserable jungle war, and he could no longer silently participate in the massive deception. The internal moral conflict violently tearing Hackworth apart was absolutely excruciating to endure. He was undeniably the most highly decorated combat officer of his entire generation, a living legendary hero deeply respected by the grunts on the ground. He had dedicated his entire adult life, his very soul, to the United States Army, since he was a desperate 15-year-old boy. To openly challenge the powerful establishment meant risking the total destruction of his massive legacy, his entire military career, and his personal reputation. Yet, his profound moral obligation to the countless young men dying pointlessly in the dark jungles heavily outweighed his own personal ambitions. He firmly decided that he could absolutely not remain a comfortable, silent insider while the deeply flawed war violently ground onward toward its inevitable, catastrophic conclusion. He quietly made a terrifying, monumental decision that would abruptly end his spectacular military career forever. He chose to publicly transform himself into one of the most incredibly controversial figures in American military history. The meticulous preparations for his explosive public rebellion were strictly conducted in absolute secrecy to prevent the army from stopping him. He carefully gathered his undeniable facts, deeply organizing his vast years of painful frontline combat experience into a devastatingly precise tactical argument. He fully understood the massive, destructive consequences of his impending actions, knowing the vindictive military establishment would relentlessly seek to destroy him completely. But his fierce warrior spirit simply refused to ever surrender to a deeply corrupt, lying system. The incredibly brave decision to actively blow the whistle on the entire failing war effort required a totally different kind of raw courage. Charging an enemy machine gun bunker heavily armed was terrifying, but publicly destroying one's own cherished institution demanded a profoundly lonely, agonizing sacrifice. He was fully prepared to become the ultimate pariah, completely sacrificing his shining stars and numerous medals to finally expose the terrible truth. The heavy silence before the impending storm was deeply agonizing for the brilliant, troubled colonel. As the fateful day rapidly approached, Hackworth reflected deeply on the silent, deadly Australian ghosts he had deeply admired at Nui Dat. They had quietly taught him that true professional excellence never requires loud boasts or massive, blinding explosions to prove its ultimate worth. True excellence is quietly surviving the brutal nightmare, efficiently accomplishing the dark mission, and bringing every single man safely back home. The arrogant American generals had fundamentally failed this most basic, sacred test of military leadership and human decency. Those tragic aluminum caskets endlessly kept arriving home strictly because of the pathological, toxic pride of the highly incompetent commanding generals. Watching the precious blood of his brave Yiping comrades carelessly spilled for the vanity of insulated armchair strategists pushing paper in Washington was unbearable. The intense, righteous fury burning deeply within David Hackworth finally crossed absolutely all reasonable limits of human endurance and professional restraint. He was rapidly passing the critical point of absolutely no return in his stellar military career. The rigid military machine forcefully demanded completely unconditional loyalty and absolute silent obedience from every single officer within its massive ranks. But the legendary colonel was actively preparing to boldly do something completely unprecedented in the long, proud history of the American military. He meticulously planned a spectacular, highly public professional suicide right on national television that would violently shake the entire nation to its absolute core. The brutal, unvarnished truth was finally about to be forcefully unleashed upon an unsuspecting American public. How could a brilliant military genius possibly continue to survive when his own beloved system was actively rotting entirely from the inside out? The stubborn American military was blindly throwing the precious lives of young men straight into a brutal, unforgiving meat grinder. Hackworth clearly knew this massive, corrupt machine simply could not ever be saved using outdated traditional methods or quiet internal memos. The shining light of ultimate combat truth was not found in Washington, but rather in the tragic sacrifices made. The greatest American soldier vividly saw the bloody truth that the Pentagon purposely ignored. To save lives, he was about to deliver a humiliating blow to the United States military. A massive clash between superpower ego and battlefield reality was about to explode. Would the system crush him? Or would his explosive televised rebellion force the nation to finally awake? The stage was set for a shocking betrayal that would permanently destroy his career and send him into a mysterious, sun-drenched exile. On the 27th of June, 1971, the physical environment drastically shifted from the blood-soaked, terrifying jungles of South Vietnam to the freezing, brightly lit television studios of the American Broadcasting Company. Colonel David Hackworth firmly sat before the probing national cameras of the popular program Issues and Answers, looking directly into the living rooms of millions of unsuspecting American citizens. He completely stripped away the polished, dishonest institutional facade that the Pentagon had carefully constructed over many bloody years. The most decorated combat soldier in America was finally ready to unleash the devastating truth upon a deeply divided nation. Without any hesitation or political doublespeak, Hackworth methodically dropped an absolute bombshell that instantly destroyed his entire illustrious military career. Before a completely stunned national audience, he did exactly what absolutely no actively serving military officer of his senior rank had ever dared to do in American history. He aggressively and publicly condemned the entire Vietnam War as a fundamentally unwinnable military disaster. He bravely stated that the massive accumulation of American technological superiority was completely useless when misapplied by highly incompetent strategic leadership, stubbornly relying on fundamentally flawed, outdated conventional warfare doctrines against a highly fluid enemy. The furious colonel aggressively attacked the deeply entrenched military leadership that had systematically produced disaster after bloody disaster without ever accepting any personal responsibility. He ruthlessly challenged the entire strategic approach that had misguided American military involvement from the very beginning of the tragic conflict. He boldly explained that the endless pursuit of high enemy body counts had completely corrupted the institutional soul of the proud United States Army, turning honorable young men into brutalized killers while simultaneously failing to secure any actual, lasting strategic victories on the chaotic ground. The brutal honesty was utterly breathtaking to witness. During the explosive interview, the interviewer pressed him on the gravity of his public claims against the highest levels of the American military command. Looking directly into the camera lens with cold, unwavering combat eyes, Hackworth stated that the generals did not understand the true nature of the guerrilla war they were fighting. He declared that American troops were being pointlessly sacrificed to protect the fragile egos and shiny careers of incompetent officers, safely hiding behind massive desks in Washington. He spoke entirely for the voiceless dead soldiers whose tragic sacrifices had been completely wasted by arrogant leaders. The institutional reaction from the terrified military establishment was immediately violent, utterly devastating, and highly vindictive. The furious Pentagon leadership instantaneously demanded his immediate resignation from the armed forces, desperately seeking to silence their most credible and dangerous internal critic. Highly decorated fellow officers who had previously praised his unmatched combat record and exceptional battlefield leadership now cowardly denounced him as a treasonous radical. The massive system he had faithfully served since childhood rapidly turned its massive, destructive bureaucratic weaponry directly against him in a desperate, pathetic attempt to completely assassinate his stellar professional character. His incredible collection of over 90 prestigious combat decorations suddenly meant absolutely nothing to an arrogant military establishment he had just so publicly humiliated. His numerous Purple Hearts, his multiple Silver Stars, and his distinguished battlefield commissions were instantly discarded by vindictive generals who felt personally attacked by his undeniable truths. David Hackworth, widely considered the absolute finest combat officer of his entire generation, became an isolated, hated pariah literally overnight. The very same army that had aggressively molded him into a living legend now actively sought to completely erase his name from their pristine official histories. This massive institutional betrayal was a profoundly agonizing experience for a dedicated warrior who had sacrificed absolutely everything for his beloved country. He had miraculously survived countless terrifying firefights, freezing Korean winters, and suffocating Vietnamese jungles, only to be cowardly stabbed in the back by politicians wearing tailored uniforms. The military demanded absolute blind loyalty to a failing strategy, but Hackworth had chosen ultimate loyalty to the bleeding men actually fighting the brutal war. This fundamental philosophical division could never be reconciled, leaving the legendary colonel entirely alone, standing amidst the burning wreckage of his once promising career. While millions of frustrated anti-war civilians immediately celebrated his unprecedented television appearance as a courageous act of supreme moral clarity, the military brass quietly seethed with uncontrollable rage. They fundamentally viewed his brutal honesty not as a necessary catalyst for vital institutional reform, but strictly as an unforgivable breach of sacred professional brotherhood. The rigid Pentagon heavily pressured media outlets and systematically launched whispered smear campaigns designed to aggressively paint the brilliant tactical commander as a psychologically broken, severely disgruntled employee. They desperately needed the American public to completely dismiss his deeply informed, devastatingly accurate strategic critiques. Facing complete professional excommunication, the disgraced hero could have simply stayed comfortably in America to capitalize on his newfound celebrity status among political activists. He could have easily leveraged his massive fame into a highly lucrative civilian career, comfortably writing best-selling books and delivering expensive speeches about urgent military reform. Many seasoned political observers thoroughly expected exactly this predictable outcome from the highly outspoken, newly retired colonel. He possessed the perfect opportunity to comfortably transition into a wealthy public intellectual, safely shielded from the continuous wrath of his former commanding generals in the comfortable American media landscape. However, David Hackworth fundamentally despised the shallow, deeply hypocritical nature of American political discourse just as much as he hated the military bureaucracy. He simply refused to ever become another comfortable talking head, actively profiting from the tragic, bloody misery he had just desperately tried to stop. He possessed absolutely no desire to constantly defend his honorable actions to ignorant civilians who had never experienced the terrifying reality of a deadly jungle ambush. The suffocating atmosphere of a deeply fractured America completely disgusted the weary combat veteran, forcing him to aggressively search for a radical alternative path. Instead of surrendering to the predictable American media circus, David Hackworth deliberately made a life-altering choice that thoroughly shocked absolutely everyone who knew him well. He aggressively turned his tired back on the massive, ungrateful country he had bravely bled for over 3 intense decades of continuous frontline service. He quietly packed his limited personal belongings, permanently left his homeland, and shockingly bought a one-way plane ticket traveling directly to the continent of Australia. The ultimate American warrior simply walked away from the American empire, choosing a deeply mysterious path of voluntary exile that puzzled military historians. Why would the absolute most decorated soldier in the formidable history of the United States Army actively choose such an incredibly drastic, isolating path? Being violently rejected by his own beloved nation was a deeply traumatic emotional wound, leaving a legendary hero utterly without a true homeland to call his own. He was a brilliant, displaced warrior, desperately seeking a professional sanctuary where his massive sacrifices and brutal honesty would be properly understood rather than aggressively punished. Hackworth deliberately aimed his subsequent life choices to serve as the ultimate, unforgiving insult against the arrogant Pentagon command structure. Completely rejected by his beloved country and violently betrayed by the military machine, where does a heavily decorated hero without a nation go? Hackworth could have easily hidden away in some quiet corner of the United States to silently lick his deep emotional wounds forever, but he absolutely refused to disappear quietly. Instead, he bought a one-way ticket to a foreign land, delivering the ultimate, everlasting slap directly into the arrogant face of the Pentagon. His deeply shocking next decision would not only stun America, but permanently reshape our fundamental understanding of true military history. David Hackworth ultimately arrived on the sun-drenched shores of the Australian Gold Coast, seeking a completely new existence far away from American political toxicity. This stunning location was a beautiful tropical paradise of endless sandy beaches and vibrant blue waters, contrasting sharply with the miserable dark jungles of Vietnam. Here, the most highly decorated combat soldier in the history of the United States Army actively chose to quietly build a peaceful civilian life. He deliberately settled exactly among the exceptional foreign soldiers he deeply respected far more than his own arrogant American commanding generals. For an entire decade stretching from 1971 to 1981, this legendary military exile successfully established several highly profitable private business ventures in property development. He peacefully raised a loving family whose young children naturally grew up speaking with thick Australian accents and fully absorbing local cultural values. He seamlessly integrated himself directly into a robust local society that strongly valued the exact same honorable qualities he always deeply admired in elite combat troops. He instantly found profound comfort in their refreshing directness, their quiet professional competence, and their completely unpretentious, raw physical courage. The deeply respectful Australian military veterans eagerly welcomed this famous American expatriate warmly into their tight community without any hesitation whatsoever. The hardened combat men who had previously served at the remote Nui base immediately recognized Hackworth as a highly distinguished fellow professional. They perfectly understood the massive, unspoken compliment implicit in his deliberate physical presence living directly among them permanently. He was not merely politely tolerated as a wealthy foreign guest, but actively embraced as an absolute equal who fully understood their superior, highly effective jungle warfare methodology. During his many subsequent decades working as a highly influential global military correspondent, Hackworth ruthlessly criticized powerful American generals continuously. He aggressively tore apart numerous arrogant United States Secretaries of Defense and loudly condemned powerful American presidents for their massive strategic failures. However, regarding the military forces of Australia, he absolutely never publicly uttered a single negative word throughout his entire professional life. This profound, deliberate silence speaks substantially louder than absolutely any formal written praise he could have possibly offered to his adopted foreign homeland. The most brutally honest military critic in American history fundamentally found absolutely nothing to criticize regarding the Australian military culture. The deeply bitter man who actively built his legendary reputation on constantly speaking deeply uncomfortable truths to massive power found absolute perfection there. His 10 long years peacefully living on the sunny Gold Coast represented the absolute highest professional compliment David Hackworth could ever properly pay. By simply voting with his very own feet, he permanently endorsed the ultimate superiority of the elite Australian jungle warriors forever. Interestingly, the arrogant American military establishment eventually absorbed some of these incredibly vital tactical lessons many tragic decades later. The highly specialized modern special operations community that slowly emerged from the terrible ashes of the massive Vietnam disaster eventually learned. They fully incorporated numerous silent operational principles that Hackworth had so passionately championed back during that highly controversial, deeply painful war. The highly lethal methods currently employed by elite Army Rangers and legendary Navy SEALs bear a strikingly undeniable resemblance to those ancient Australian techniques. Modern American elite forces finally operate with the extreme tactical sophistication and absolute battlefield patience that their stubborn Vietnam-era predecessors severely lacked. This deeply profound institutional transformation ultimately required countless decades of continuous, painful operational failure before arrogant American generals finally woke up. It sadly cost thousands of entirely additional highly unnecessary American lives in numerous subsequent global conflicts where blind firepower approaches completely failed. It ultimately required massive institutional humiliation before any genuine, life-saving institutional learning could ever properly begin within the massive Pentagon bureaucracy. If the arrogant Pentagon leadership had only humbly listened to the brilliant Colonel David Hackworth way back in the bloody year of 1969, if they had aggressively studied the highly successful Australian combat methods, instead of deliberately classifying urgent internal reports about their undeniable superiority, if they had prioritized actual battlefield effectiveness over protecting their extremely fragile institutional pride, massive historical tragedies could have been easily avoided entirely. We must painfully wonder exactly how many thousands of precious young American lives might have been miraculously saved. The legendary Australian Special Air Service Regiment continues to successfully operate globally today, still effectively employing the fundamental core methods refined heavily at Nui Dat. Their highly skilled modern successors have bravely fought in East Timor, the harsh mountains of Afghanistan, and the brutal urban landscapes of Iraq. They remain globally respected as some of the absolute finest, most incredibly lethal special operations forces currently existing anywhere on Earth today, and somewhere deeply embedded within the proud institutional memory of that elite regiment, Hackworth's profound story persists. For the brave men and women who proudly wear the iconic sandy beret of the Australian SAS, Hackworth's deliberate historical choice remains the ultimate professional compliment. The absolute finest combat officer that the mighty United States ever produced clearly looked at their quiet methods and boldly declared them vastly superior. He bravely backed that completely honest tactical assessment with his entire professional career, his massive legendary reputation, and finally his lifelong peaceful exile. You absolutely cannot ever purchase that kind of incredibly powerful historical military endorsement anywhere. David Hackworth peacefully passed away on May 4, 2005, at the grand age of 74 years old after a truly incredible life. His numerous public obituaries heavily focused on his astonishing combat decorations, his highly controversial television appearance, and his later career as a fierce military correspondent. Most major American newspapers predictably mentioned his Australian exile only in passing, if they even bothered to mention it at all. But those few educated historians who truly understood his tragic story deeply recognized its massive hidden significance. The American soldier, possessing 90 medals, brilliantly used his very own life to cast the ultimate defining vote for genuine tactical greatness on the battlefield. He deliberately left behind a heavily blood-soaked historical lesson that arrogant America required several deeply painful decades and countless tragic young lives to finally absorb. Endless amounts of printed money can absolutely never purchase fundamental battlefield truth against a deeply determined enemy hiding within the trees. The ultimate military weapon is absolutely never advanced technology. but rather profound human humility before the overwhelming power of unforgiving nature. Every single time a highly trained modern American special operator patiently employs complete stealth instead of loudly calling for massive, overwhelming aerial bombing support today, every time a smart military commander humbly sends his young officers to learn directly from foreign allies instead of falsely assuming guaranteed American global superiority, the legendary ghost of Colonel David Hackworth silently nods in absolute, proud approval from somewhere deep within the humid green shadows. He sacrificed absolutely everything for this vital truth, firmly proving that genuine military victory always belongs exclusively to those who deeply respect the quiet jungle.